6 months after the storm that exposed the town's darkest secret, war veteran William Mercer and his loyal K-9 partner Rebel are trying to rebuild a quiet life in Coyote Ridge, Texas. But when a mysterious journalist arrives with questions about the missing millions from the Western Line scandal, and Rebel begins reacting to strangers like he's sensed danger before, William realizes the past isn't buried yet. What they uncover beneath the red soil will test everything they fought for. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe justice can rise from the ashes, hit like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning in Coyote Ridge, Texas, opened with wind and dust. A pale sun drifted above the low hills, lighting the cracked soil and rusted oil pipes that snaked through the barren land. The air was thick with the scent of iron, gasoline, and dry grass, a smell that never truly left this place. On the edge of town, in a weathered wooden house with peeling paint and a tin roof that moaned in the wind, lived William Mercer, a man who had once worn a ranger's uniform and carried the weight of war in his silence. 3 years had passed since he came back from Afghanistan, yet his mind never fully left the desert. William was 42, broad-shouldered, his body still carrying the disciplined stillness of a soldier. His face was lean, the jaw rough with a short, graying beard, and a narrow scar crossed above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a night ambush near Helmand. He had pale grey eyes, the kind that seemed to see both the present and something beyond it, something only he remembered. He rarely spoke to anyone, not out of arrogance, but because words no longer felt necessary. The rhythm of a welding torch or the hum of machinery was easier to live with than small talk. To most people in Coyote Ridge, he was a quiet worker with calloused hands who mended broken fences and oil valves for cash. To himself, he was a man trying not to remember too much. Beside him lived Rebel, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a strong frame, thick grey and black coat, and intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand far more than they should. His left ear drooped slightly, a scar from shrapnel years ago, and a faint limp marked his step. Yet, like his owner, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Rebel had once been a military K-9, trained to detect explosives and follow human scent through chaos. Now, he guarded an old porch and watched the horizon with the patience of an old soldier. When thunder rolled, he trembled. When nightmares woke William in the middle of the night, Rebel would climb onto the bed, resting his head on William's chest, until the shaking stopped. They were each other's last unit. Sometimes the silence was broken by Martha Grady, William's neighbor from the next property over. She was a small, stooped woman in her late 60s, with silver hair braided neatly down her back and hands calloused from years of tending her land. Her eyes were pale blue and kind, though worry seemed to have settled into their corners. She would appear at his door with a jar of peach jam or a loaf of homemade bread, saying in her soft, husky voice, "You need to eat proper food, Will. You're too thin for a man who works all day." William would smile faintly, thank her, and set the jar aside, often forgetting it on the shelf for weeks. To him, Martha's kindness was both a comfort and a quiet ache, a reminder of gentler things he no longer knew how to accept. Still, he fixed her fence, sharpened her tools, and carried hay to her barn without being asked. That was his way of speaking gratitude. His days passed in patterns, the hiss of welding, the clang of metal, the smell of heated iron. The workshop on the outskirts of town became his refuge. He worked in a sweat-stained shirt, sleeves rolled up, muscles tightening under the glow of the torchlight. The younger men sometimes joked, calling him Ghost Ranger, because he never joined their talk, never laughed at their stories. They invited him for a drink after work, but he always shook his head. At sunset, he would walk home along the dirt road, boots crunching on gravel, the vast silence around him pressing close. Rebel would be waiting by the gate, tail moving once, twice, enough to say, "You're home." And William would nod, answering in the same quiet way, "For now." Yet, even in peace, war followed him. Some nights he woke to the echo of explosions that no longer existed, his chest tightening as if the air itself had turned into smoke. Rebel's calm breathing beside him was the only thing that pulled him back from those shadows. Lately, however, something in the air had changed. For several nights, the wind carried a new smell: diesel, fresh asphalt, and the sharp tang of metal cutting into the earth. At the far end of the ridge, unfamiliar lights flickered, bright and artificial against the open plain. One morning, Martha mentioned seeing men in yellow vests drilling near her fields. "They say it's for a new pipeline," she murmured, frowning. William didn't answer. He just turned toward the horizon, eyes narrowing slightly. The sunlight caught his scar, turning it white for an instant. Rebel lifted his head, ears pricked. The silence between them felt heavy, charged as if the land itself was holding its breath. Something was coming to Coyote Ridge, something that would soon break their fragile peace. The next morning broke under a thick haze of dust. The sun rose slow and red, hanging low over the ridge like a dying coal. From the porch, William could hear the low hum of engines rolling down the dirt road again. He already knew who it was before the sound reached his ears. The same trucks, Western Line Energy, their silver logos catching the light like teeth. Rebel's ears perked up, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. William set his coffee down, his jaw tightening as he watched them pull up to the Grady farm again. Brett Corman stepped out first, his shadow long across the dirt. He looked freshly shaven, the scent of expensive aftershave mixing with gasoline and sweat. Beneath his clean shirt, his arms carried the weight of someone who had lived on violence too long. He had been handsome once, in a hard, military way, but the arrogance had eaten away at it, leaving only edges. His eyes had that hollow brightness of a man who liked to see fear reflected back at him. Behind him came two subordinates, one tall and thin with a nervous twitch, the other shorter and heavy-set, his neck sunburned red. They looked less like engineers and more like enforcers. Martha Grady stood her ground again at the gate. Her small frame seemed almost swallowed by the rising dust, but her hands didn't tremble this time. "You've had my answer, Mr. Corman," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This is my land. My husband built this house with his hands, and I won't let it be torn apart for your company's greed." Brett smirked, his lips curling. "Mrs. Grady, you make it sound like I'm the bad guy here. We're trying to bring jobs, development, progress. You'll thank us one day." He took a step closer, his tone dropping lower, more dangerous. "But if you don't take our offer, I can't promise what'll happen when construction begins." That was when William appeared at the edge of the road, Rebel pacing quietly at his side. His boots crunched against the gravel, his shadow cutting across the sunlight. "She said no," William said evenly. "You heard her." The two men behind Brett shifted uneasily. Corman turned toward him, his grin fading into a thin line. For a second, his eyes scanned William's face as if pulling an old file from memory. "Mercer," he said finally, with something between mockery and surprise. "Ranger, right? Kandahar." He laughed dryly. "I remember you. The guy who didn't know when to keep his head down." He took a long, slow breath through his nose. "I guess some men never learn." William's expression didn't change. The wind pressed his shirt against his chest, revealing the lean muscle of someone who still trained out of habit, maybe penance. "You've learned all the wrong lessons," he said quietly. "War's over, Brett, but you're still fighting ghosts." The space between them shrank until only Rebel's low growl cut the silence. Corman's face twisted. He reached out, gripping William's shoulder roughly. The movement was fast, instinctive, but William's response was faster. His hand came up, deflecting the grip, twisting Corman's wrist until the man hissed in pain and stepped back. For a heartbeat, it seemed violence would follow. Then, with a forced laugh, Brett raised both hands in mock surrender. "Easy, soldier," he sneered. "Don't want anyone getting hurt over a piece of dirt." He nodded to his men. "We're done here." When the trucks roared away, Martha turned to William, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and gratitude. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "They'll come back. Men like him don't forget humiliation." William looked toward the horizon, where the trucks disappeared in a cloud of red dust. "I know," he said, "but someone has to stand up first." Rebel pressed against his leg, tail still stiff. The dog seemed to sense that a line had been crossed that morning, one that couldn't be walked back. That evening, just as the last light drained from the hills, a single vehicle rolled into William's driveway. The slow crunch of tires on gravel made Rebel rise from the porch, tail rigid, ears forward. William stepped outside to meet the visitor. It was Sheriff Cole Danner, dressed in his tan uniform, boots polished, badge shining faintly under the porch light. He was a broad man in his 50s, with grey creeping into his beard and eyes that had once been sharp but were now dulled by compromise. His left leg carried a slight limp from an old Marine injury, the kind that never healed right. He was the kind of man who spoke softly but carried authority like a weapon. "Evening, Will," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind if I come up?" William gave a small nod. The sheriff climbed the steps, his presence filling the porch. "Heard you had a little run-in today," Danner said, his tone light, almost friendly. "Brett Corman's not someone you want to mess with. His company's got reach, investors, lawyers, friends in Austin. You don't want trouble, do you?" William leaned against the porch post, his gaze steady. "I don't like bullies," he said simply. Rebel stood between them, fur bristling along his spine. The sheriff glanced at the dog, then back at William, his smile thinning. "You were a hero once," Danner said after a pause. "People respected that, but this isn't a battlefield anymore. Around here, heroes end up broke. Or worse." His voice dropped lower. "Don't get in over your head." The silence that followed was taut as a tripwire. William's eyes never left the sheriff's face. "Maybe," he said finally, "but I still know right from wrong." The sheriff sighed, adjusting his hat. "You keep thinking that way, and you'll find out the hard way this town doesn't." He turned, walking back toward his truck. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the dry air. William stood there long after the headlights vanished. The night was still, except for the steady breathing of Rebel beside him. The dog looked up, eyes gleaming in the porch light. "Yeah," William murmured, scratching behind his ear. "I know. It's coming." Over the ridge, the faint orange glow of oil rigs flickered in the darkness like distant fires, and somewhere beyond them, something was beginning to move. The wind howled that night, tearing through the dry plains like an angry spirit. The moon was a pale sliver, barely strong enough to pierce the veil of clouds. William had been sitting by the window with a cup of black coffee, listening to the creak of the porch boards and the low, rhythmic breathing of Rebel asleep by his boots. The quiet was uneasy, the kind that made his instincts stir, an old soldier's intuition that silence can turn dangerous in an instant. Then came the faint sound, distant but sharp. A crack, then another, and a glow on the horizon that didn't belong to the stars. He was already on his feet before his mind formed the thought. "Rebel up," he said, and the dog rose immediately, ears pointed, muscles tensed. By the time William reached the dirt road, the smell hit him. Thick, acrid smoke laced with burning hay and oil. Flames leapt into the sky from the direction of Martha Grady's farm. The old pickup engine roared to life as he slammed the door, tires spinning gravel into sparks. Rebel stood braced on the seat beside him, barking once, sharp and urgent. When they crested the ridge, the sight froze William's breath. The farmhouse was engulfed in fire, the roof collapsing in waves of orange and black. Sparks rained down like fireflies gone mad. The barn beside it was already half consumed. Somewhere inside that chaos, a faint cry broke through, a voice he knew. "Martha." He barely felt the heat as he leapt from the truck, his boots sinking into scorched dirt. Smoke stung his eyes, and the air itself seemed to claw at his lungs. He shouted her name again, but only the crack of burning wood answered. Rebel darted ahead, low to the ground, his bark cutting through the roar of the flames. He vanished into the doorway before William could stop him. "Rebel, no!" William coughed, covering his mouth with his sleeve, but the dog was gone. A blur swallowed by the firelight. The seconds dragged, each one heavier than the last. Then, through the orange haze, a shadow moved. Rebel reappeared, teeth gripping the sleeve of Martha's robe, dragging her limp body across the floorboards. Her grey hair was streaked with soot, and her face pale, eyes half open in shock. William rushed forward, breaking the back door open with a kick. The wood splintered under his shoulder, and a wave of heat rolled over him. He grabbed Martha under the arms, coughing violently, the smoke clawing down his throat. Rebel stumbled beside him, one leg dragging slightly. Together, they made it out as the ceiling collapsed behind them with a deafening crash. They fell to the dirt, gasping for air. Martha wheezed, clutching her chest, but she was alive. Rebel limped to her side, whining softly, his fur singed along one flank. The pads of his paws blackened with ash. William's hands trembled as he felt for her pulse. Weak, but steady. Relief washed through him, sharp and painful as breath after drowning. Then Rebel barked. Sharp, alarmed sound that made William's head snap up. The dog was sniffing frantically around the scorched remains of a truck parked near the barn. William followed, his boots crunching over broken glass. That's when he saw it. A small metal cylinder fixed under the rear bumper, a faint ticking noise coming from inside. A crude homemade timer, wired to a canister half empty of gasoline. "Jesus," he muttered, his throat raw. It wasn't an accident. He pulled Martha further away, grabbing a shovel from the ground to strike the device loose, tossing it into the dirt before it could ignite. It hit the ground and sputtered, then hissed out, the timer frozen mid-count. Rebel barked again, standing between the truck and William as if guarding against another threat. By the time the first sirens cut through the night, the fire had devoured nearly everything. The flames were smaller now, controlled only by exhaustion and the cold wind sweeping over the fields. Sheriff Cole Danner arrived with 2 deputies, their faces pale in the flickering light. Danner stepped out slowly, his silhouette framed by the flashing red and blue. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flickered briefly when he saw the scorched wreck of the truck. "Damn shame," he said finally, lighting a cigarette. "Looks like faulty wiring, or maybe an old fuse box." William turned toward him, face smeared with soot, eyes red from smoke. "You can't be serious," he rasped. "That was a bomb, Cole. Someone did this on purpose." The sheriff exhaled, the smoke curling like grey ghosts around his face. "You don't know that?" he said evenly. "No witnesses, no proof. Let's keep it simple. An accident. The report will say electrical fault. Nobody needs the drama." William took a step forward, his voice low, dangerous. "If you have any honor left, don't call this an accident." Rebel stood beside him, still limping, teeth bared in silence. For a moment, Danner's gaze wavered. Then he shrugged, flicking the cigarette into the ashes. "Honor doesn't keep a man employed, Will," he said, turning back toward his cruiser. "Be smart. Stay out of this." When the sirens faded, only the crackle of dying fire remained. Martha was wrapped in a blanket, sitting beside what used to be her home, staring at the flames with eyes that didn't seem to see. William knelt beside Rebel, cleaning the dog's burned paw with a wet rag. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. Rebel rested his head against William's knee, tail thumping once weakly. Overhead, the night was black and cold again, the stars hidden behind a curtain of smoke. William looked at the ruins of the farmhouse, the shape of destruction etched against the horizon. Somewhere deep inside, something in him hardened. This wasn't war, not officially, but the rules felt the same. Someone had drawn first blood. The morning after the fire dawned grey and hollow, the air thick with the smell of wet ash and smoke. The Grady farm was nothing but blackened skeletons of wood and twisted metal, and the ground still hissed softly as the wind blew through it. William stood among the ruins with a shovel in his hand, his shirt soaked with sweat and soot. Rebel limped beside him, one hind leg bandaged with an old cloth strip. Yet the dog refused to stay still. Every few minutes, he sniffed the charred ground, pawing at the earth as if chasing a ghost that wouldn't rest. William worked in silence, his mind still replaying the night before. Martha's screams, the explosion that never went off, and the cold face of Sheriff Danner, pretending it was all an accident. Martha was recovering in town under the care of a nurse named Claire Hensley, a woman in her 30s with calm blue eyes and the air of someone who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by it. She had come from Austin years ago to work at the small county clinic, her kindness steady but never sentimental. "You can't save everyone, Mr. Mercer," she had told him before he left that morning. "But some people need someone to believe them." William had nodded once, unable to find words. Now, standing in the ruins, he realized belief was all he had left. Rebel suddenly stopped and began scratching furiously at a patch of ground near what used to be the back porch. The soil there was different, darker, looser. William crouched, brushing aside the ash until something caught the light. A corner of laminated paper, blackened at the edges. He carefully pulled it free, revealing a torn section of an engineering map. Lines, measurements, and notations covered it, and in the corner, scrawled in faded black ink, were 3 characters that made his heart tighten. X7. Beneath it, a handwritten note, buried under old container. William stared at the map, his pulse quickening. He remembered Martha once mentioning a man named Daniel Ross, a young engineer who had worked for Western Line. Smart, idealistic, the kind who still believed rules meant something. A few months back, there had been talk of a gas explosion at one of the drilling sites. Daniel was listed as missing, presumed dead. But rumors whispered he'd found something before he vanished. William folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. The desert doesn't keep secrets well. Dust buries everything, but never erases it. The road to Well 7 lay several miles south, across a stretch of abandoned pipeline. As William drove, the land turned redder, the soil fine as powder, the air dry enough to crack the lips. The sky hung low, a faded copper dome pressing against the horizon. Rusted signs warned, "No entry." Site sealed by county order, but the padlock on the chain fence was old, half broken. William cut through it with a bolt cutter he kept behind his seat. Rebel jumped from the truck, landing lightly despite his injured leg, nose to the ground. The place smelled of old oil and iron, and something else, faint but sharp, like burned wiring. The remnants of the explosion were still visible, a crater half filled with sand, a few twisted metal beams, and, standing crooked, a shipping container streaked with rust and dust. Rebel moved ahead, circling the container, barking twice before pawing at the floor near the entrance. His nose pressed to the dirt, tail stiff, the way he used to signal danger back in Afghanistan. William knelt and rapped the ground, hollow. He grabbed a crowbar from the truck and pried open the metal paneling. Beneath it, wedged in a shallow cavity, was a steel box, scorched, dented, but sealed tight. The side was engraved faintly. D.R. Williams' hands shook as he lifted it out. Inside were a fireproof hard drive, a small USB stick, and a plastic ID card with the name Daniel Ross printed in bold. The photo showed a man in his late 20s, fair hair, a confident smile that now felt almost tragic. William carried the box back to the truck, setting it on the passenger seat. He hesitated for a long moment before connecting the drive to his old laptop. The screen flickered to life, and a series of video files appeared, time-stamped from 8 months ago. The first showed a boardroom, dimly lit, with Mayor Harold Thorne, a heavy man with slick grey hair and a politician's easy grin, shaking hands with Brett Corman. On the table between them sat a black briefcase. Thorne opened it, the camera catching a glint of bundled cash. "Consider it a token of appreciation for expedited permits," Brett's voice said smoothly. The next clip showed a construction site. A man in a hard hat arguing with someone off-screen, followed by a sudden burst of light and chaos, a controlled detonation, workers screaming. It wasn't an accident. William felt his throat tighten as he leaned closer to the screen. Each video was worse than the last. Footage of falsified safety inspections, staged injuries, falsified signatures. Evidence of a town sold off piece by piece. When the final clip ended, the cursor blinked on a black screen. William sat back, staring at nothing. Rebel's head rested on his knee, his amber eyes watching him quietly. "You found it, didn't you, Daniel?" William whispered, voice rough. "You buried the truth before they buried you." He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. The weight of the war he thought he'd left behind settled over him again. But this time, the enemy wore suits, not uniforms. "You died for the truth," he said softly. "I won't waste it." Outside, the wind kicked up the red dust, swirling around the truck like smoke. William slid the box back onto the seat, started the engine, and drove toward town. Behind him, the old oil field disappeared into the haze. But the truth was no longer buried. The sun that morning felt thin and washed out, as if the sky itself were cautious. William carried the little steel box into town, wrapped in an oil-stained towel, and walked straight to the only place that might still listen, the Coyote Ridge Gazette. The paper's office was a sagging brick building with a crooked sign, and behind its battered desk sat Marcus Hale, the editor. A man in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, thinning hair pulled back into a lazy knot, face mapped with laugh and worry lines. Marcus had an old reporter's stare. Quick, skeptical, but with a soft place for truths that hurt. When William laid the drive on the desk and told him what it contained, Marcus didn't smile. He only asked precise questions, the kind that pierce half-truths. He promised to run it first thing. 2 hours later, the sirens came, not the newsrooms, but law enforcement. Sheriff Danner arrived with deputies, moving like a dark tide. Marcus stood in the doorway, paper in hand, as his computers were seized and the hard drive taken into evidence. Danner read from a warrant with a practiced voice, then offered Marcus a look that felt like a warning. Cooperate, or be made an example. William watched the scene, feeling the room tilt. The local press, he realized, had a limit to its courage when the cost rose. Left with no local recourse, William took the box back to his truck and drove out past the last lights of town to a bend in the blacktop where the telephone poles were older than most of the houses. He dug out a military-issued SATCOM handset he kept packed for emergencies, a relic from a deployment and a lifeline he had never wanted to use. He keyed the encrypted frequency and waited until a voice answered. The voice belonged to Ethan Price, 40, lean as a wire, with a close-cropped beard and eyes that saw signals the rest of the world missed. Ethan had been the comms tech on William's last rotation, the man who could pull a link out of static. After the service, he drifted into freelance cybersecurity work, patching networks for small-town clinics and odd campaign offices. When William told him what happened, Ethan's reply was direct. "Don't route it through anything local. I'll open an anonymous channel to a couple of whistleblower platforms and mirror it to media outlets in Austin and an encrypted veterans forum. Once it's out, it's out." William felt the old soldier's muscle memory in his hands as he followed Ethan's instructions, connecting the drive, booting the battered laptop, layering encryption like bandages. The upload crawled at first, then surged, a choked groan of data becoming truth. He typed a simple file name and hit send. Veteran exposes oil corruption in Texas. Within hours, the ripple became a roar. The clip, raw and unadorned, landed on multiple platforms. Comments and messages cascaded in. Strangers thanking him, veteran groups sharing, a regional journalist in Dallas picking the story, up and tagging a national outlet. Hashtags trended. An angry, hopeful tide formed in the comment threads. But visibility invited pressure. Unmarked vehicles began to appear where none had before. A dark sedan parked across from his mailbox, a truck idling at the end of the lane like a waiting animal. There were late-night calls with only the hum of breath on the line and the click of hang-ups. Then, the first real escalation. A bullet punched through the drywall of his living room, a neat, ominous pinhole that sent plaster dust down like a snowfall. Rebel's ears snapped. The dog sprang to the window, muscles braided with tension. William found himself pacing, hearing phantom rounds and the rhythm of far-off rotors in his chest, his palms damp. Sleep grew shallow. Dreams bled into day. The old flashbacks returned. Not full battle scenes, but fragments, the smell of cordite, the metallic scream of impact, a buddy's hand slipping from his. He had kept moving for years because movement kept the past from catching him. Now the past breathed close again, heavier than before. On the fourth night after the upload, when the house felt small and the dark seemed to lean in with intent, William sat on the edge of his bed and let his head fall into his hands. He could feel the city's noise through the walls, the distant pulse of sirens, the current of angry talk online. But inside, the thud of his heart sounded loud and solitary. Rebel climbed up without ceremony and settled his head on William's palm. The dog's breath was warm, steadied, ordinary. For a long time, William simply held that weight. The animal's head, the pulse under the skin, the small living proof that something loyal still existed in the world. A text blinked on his dark phone. Claire's name. "Be careful. You did the right thing." He closed his eyes and let the words rest against his ribcage. The pressure around him did not vanish, but it shifted from an avalanche to a challenge. He had stood at the mouth of the desert and watched men burn a life to make money. He had watched officials close eyes and mouths. Now the whole country's gaze made the next steps unavoidable. William drew a breath that tasted like cold metal, set his jaw, and felt the old calculation return. Choose and accept the cost. He whispered to the dog at his feet, voice steadying. "No, this time I won't run." The storm came down like punishment. The wind lashed through the valley, bending the mesquite trees to the ground, and rain beat the roof of William's house in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if the sky were reminding him how small men could be. Lightning split the horizon, and a single message blinked on his cracked phone screen. They took her. No name, no number, just the text and a set of coordinates. He knew immediately who her meant. Martha Grady. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one building in his chest. He loaded the shotgun with practiced hands, each shell clicking into place like a heartbeat. Rebel circled the door, tail stiff, eyes bright in the flicker of the porch light. His shoulder was still healing, the fur shaved and stitched where the bullet had grazed him, but he stood alert, ready. William ran his hand down the dog's neck. "You don't have to come," he murmured. Rebel gave a soft whine. Refusal. There was never a choice for either of them. William threw on his raincoat, checked the sidearm, and stepped into the night. The drive to Well 9 cut through black fields, drowning in rainwater. The headlights carved tunnels through the downpour, and mud splattered up the fenders like blood. The site had been closed for years, abandoned after a gas collapse, but now the fences stood open, and floodlights pulsed through the storm. The place looked like something from another world. Twisted machinery, rusted cranes, the slick gleam of water pooling over cracked concrete. Somewhere behind those lights, a generator hummed, steady and cruel. When he stepped out, the rain hit him like nails. Rebel trotted ahead, low to the ground, nose twitching. There was movement near the main rig. Shadows, then the faint echo of laughter. William moved closer, crouched behind a tanker shell. Lightning flashed, and in that instant, he saw them clearly. Brett Corman standing by the railing, trench coat plastered to his shoulders, gun loose in his hand, his grin stretched and cold. Two other men flanked him, both armed, faces hidden by the hoods of their slickers. At their feet, tied to a chair under the dripping framework, was Martha, soaked, shivering, her grey hair matted to her face. "Well," Brett called over the rain, his voice sharp as the crack of thunder. "The hero shows up after all. I was beginning to think you'd finally learned to mind your own business." William stepped out from cover, shotgun raised. "Let her go." His voice was low but carried across the wind. Brett laughed, tipping his head. "Let her go? You think this is about her? You embarrassed me, Mercer. You ruined a good thing. You made us all look weak." He took a step forward, his gun now steady. "So here we are, ending this like men." Lightning burned white again, and the whole sight became a frozen photograph. 3 gunmen, 1 bound hostage, 1 man and his dog facing them. Then came the sound of a shot. Rebel lunged before William could react, a blur of fur and fury slamming into Brett's chest. The bullet fired wild, ricocheting off a steel beam. Brett fell back, cursing, as Rebel bit into his arm. The other 2 men moved, raising their weapons. William fired once, the shotgun kicking hard, dropping one of them with a cry. The second ducked behind a drum, returning fire. William felt a searing pain in his shoulder, spinning him backward, but he stayed up. Survival was older than pain. He chambered another round, fired again. The second man collapsed into the mud. Brett staggered to his feet, blood streaming down his sleeve. Rebel lay on his side, whining softly, a dark patch spreading through his fur near the shoulder. William's heart clenched, the kind of pain words couldn't touch. Brett pointed the gun at him, teeth bared. "You should have stayed quiet, soldier," he hissed. "Your justice dies here, same as that dog." William's vision narrowed to a single tunnel. The rain blurred everything but Brett's face, the smirk of a man who thought he had won. Then Rebel moved, slow, deliberate. Despite the wound, he dragged himself up, growling deep in his throat, a sound like thunder rising from the earth. Brett hesitated, that 1 second of human doubt. It was enough. William swung the shovel he'd picked up from the ground. The blow struck square across Brett's wrist. The gun flew, clattering across the wet concrete. William stepped forward, grabbed Brett by the coat, and drove his fist into the man's face. Once, twice. Then he stopped, breathing hard, rain washing blood from his knuckles. Brett slumped to the ground, groaning. William looked at him, chest heaving, then turned to Martha, cutting the ropes with his knife. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded weakly. Rebel crawled closer, pressing his head into William's knee. "Good boy," William whispered, voice cracking. The sirens were distant, but growing louder. Claire must have called after she saw the upload tracker go dark. Blue and red lights flickered through the storm as sheriff's vehicles closed in. Danner stepped out of the first car, rain soaking through his hat brim. For once, he didn't look composed. His eyes went from Brett to William to the wounded dog. "It's over," he said quietly. "We got the footage this time. It's everywhere now. Thorne's already in custody." William knelt beside Rebel, wrapping his jacket around the dog's trembling body. "It's not over," he murmured, "but it's a start." Above them, lightning split the clouds again, revealing a sky that for the first time in years didn't feel hostile, just clean. The morning after the storm was eerily calm. The clouds had broken apart into long streaks of gold and grey, the kind of sky that carried both sorrow and promise. William sat motionless in the hallway of the Fort Sterling Military Veterinary Hospital, the white fluorescent light flickering faintly above him. His shirt was still wet with mud and blood, dried stiff at the cuffs. His hands, cracked, blackened from oil and rain, were clasped together, motionless on his knees. The sound of boots echoed occasionally down the corridor, nurses and orderlies moving briskly past. But to him, time had folded into silence. Rebel was somewhere behind the closed steel doors of the operating room. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and clean, the opposite of everything he'd known the night before. Across the hall, a woman in a grey coat approached. She was Dr. Elena Ward, the senior veterinary surgeon of the facility. Tall, mid-40s, dark hair tied into a neat bun, her movements precise but gentle. Her face bore that quiet strength of someone who had seen too much pain, yet never hardened to it. "You were his handler?" she asked softly. William nodded once, his throat too dry for words. She sat beside him, her gloves still speckled with faint traces of iodine. The bullet missed the vital artery. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stubborn. That's good. Stubborn animals usually make it. She gave a small smile, professional but warm. You trained him well, Mr. Mercer. You gave him reason to fight. William's jaw tightened. No, he said after a pause. He gave me one. Outside, the world had already changed. News spread faster than fire in dry grass. Headlines flashed across televisions, phones, and digital boards. Texas veteran and canine partner expose statewide energy corruption. Photos of William in the rain, carrying Rebel through the wreckage, were everywhere. Some taken by first responders, others by civilians who had filmed the arrest at Well 9. Reporters camped near the county jail. The mayor, Harold Thorne, was taken into federal custody, his lawyer silent under the weight of the evidence. Sheriff Danner was suspended pending investigation. Brett Corman, his arm still in a sling, had signed a full confession after a night in interrogation. The FBI arrived by helicopter, agents in dark suits fanning across the burned fields, collecting what was left of Western Line's empire. But William stayed away from it all. He had given his statement, answered the questions, and walked out before the flashbulbs could find him. The town had begun to stir in a different way, not out of fear, but gratitude. Hand-painted signs appeared along the main street. Thank you, Mercer and Rebel. Old men at the diner raised their coffee mugs when his name was mentioned. Children left notes near his fence. Yet he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He had fought his last war, and victory, he realized, was quieter than he'd imagined. The door to the recovery room opened with a soft hiss. Dr. Ward appeared again, wiping her hands on a towel. Her expression was different this time, lighter. Mr. Mercer, she said, you can come in now. William rose slowly, his legs unsteady from hours of waiting. The room smelled of medicine and metal. Rebel lay on a table lined with white sheets, his fur shaved along one shoulder where the wound had been stitched. A bandage wrapped around his chest, but his eyes, those bright amber eyes, opened when William stepped closer. His tail thumped once against the sheet, weak but sure. William sank to his knees beside the table, one hand trembling as it touched the dog's muzzle. Rebel licked his wrist, a simple gesture, but it broke something open inside him. You made it, partner, he whispered, voice thick. You made it home. For the first time in years, the soldier's face crumpled. Not from pain, but release. Dr. Ward turned quietly to give them privacy, closing the door halfway. Days later, the storm of attention faded. The town of Coyote Ridge began rebuilding. Fences mended, land reclaimed. The site of the Grady farm was now a clearing of ash and grass, and the townspeople gathered there one morning to plant new trees. Martha stood beside William, her arm in a sling, but her eyes steady. You know, she said, watching the horizon, maybe this land finally got what it needed. A little truth in the soil. William nodded, saying nothing. Rebel sat between them, his gait uneven but improving, the sunlight catching on his fur. That afternoon, William repaired the broken fence at his property line. The rhythm of hammer against wood felt almost like peace. A truck pulled up near the gate. A small white government vehicle. Dr. Ward stepped out, her grey coat now replaced with a casual jacket, her hair down. Mr. Mercer, she called, smiling. I thought you might want to hear it from me. Rebel's healing faster than we expected. He'll walk again, maybe even run. For a moment, William just stared, unable to speak. Then he laughed, a rough, quiet sound, and his knees gave out. The dust rose around him, mixing with the tears on his face. The doctor said nothing, only stood by, hands in her pockets, watching the man and the dog who had somehow carried each other through war, corruption, and fire into daylight. The late summer wind carried the scent of new grass and sawdust through Coyote Ridge. Where the old ruins once stood, sunlight now spilled across a patchwork of rebuilt fences, new roofs, and fields beginning to turn green again. The sound of hammers had replaced gunfire. The scent of earth replaced the bitter tang of smoke. It had been 3 months since the storm, and the town had begun to remember what peace sounded like. William Mercer walked the dirt road toward the rebuilt Grady Ranch, his worn boots leaving prints in the red dust. Rebel trotted beside him, his gait slower but proud, the limp barely noticeable now. The dog's fur had grown back thick and glossy, a faint scar visible under the right shoulder where the bullet had passed. Children waved as he passed, calling his name before crouching to greet Rebel. The dog, patient and calm, allowed small hands to tug gently at his ears before returning to William's side. People had begun to call him the guardian of Coyote Ridge, though William always laughed it off. The Grady Ranch was alive again. Martha Grady, her grey hair neatly braided, leaned against the new fence with a cup of coffee in hand. Her eyes, lined with age but alive with mischief, softened when she saw them approach. "You two look like you finally belong to the land again," she said. "Not ghosts wandering it." William smiled faintly. "Guess the land decided to let us stay." Behind her, the new barn bore a fresh wooden sign, Rebel Foundation. A group of volunteers, veterans and locals alike, were unloading supplies for the new shelter that would house and rehabilitate retired service dogs. Inside the barn, Tomas Rivera, a former Marine medic in his 30s, stocky and cheerful, organized crates of medical equipment. His short black hair was dusted with hay, and a tattoo of an angel's wing peeked from under his sleeve. "Morning, Will," he called out. "You see this turnout? Half the county wants to help. Even the high school kids are volunteering." His grin was infectious. "Guess your dog's more famous than you now." William chuckled quietly. That's the way it should be. Later that afternoon, the town gathered for the dedication ceremony. The mayor's office had been dissolved, replaced by a citizens' council led by honest locals like Martha and Claire Hensley, the nurse whose compassion had quietly held the town together during its darkest days. Claire, now in jeans and a light blue blouse, stood at the podium. She was in her late 30s, with auburn hair tied back and freckles across her cheeks that deepened when she smiled. "Coyote Ridge isn't a story of corruption anymore," she said into the microphone. "It's a story of rebuilding, of courage that didn't come from power or politics, but from people who refused to give up." The crowd applauded, and she gestured toward William and Rebel, sitting quietly near the fence line. "And it's a story of two friends who reminded us what loyalty looks like." Rebel barked once, almost as if on cue, and laughter rolled through the crowd. For the first time, William didn't shrink from the attention. He stood, nodded to the people, then to Claire. The sunlight caught his face, older now, lined by time and burden, but peaceful. After the ceremony, a young journalist approached him. Eli Turner, mid-20s, tall and thin, camera hanging from his neck, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Mr. Mercer," he asked, "people all over the country are calling you a hero. Do you think that's true?" William paused. His gaze drifted toward the open field, where Rebel chased a soccer ball the children had thrown, his bark echoing joyfully through the warm air. "No," he said finally. "Heroes don't come home looking for peace. I'm just someone who got lucky, someone with a friend who taught me that justice doesn't need a uniform." Eli smiled quietly, lowering his camera. "That's the best headline I've heard in a long time." As evening fell, the town began to disperse. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the hills, painting everything in amber and gold. William and Rebel walked back toward their small farmhouse at the edge of town. The house looked different now, repaired, but still simple, its porch sagging just enough to creak when the wind blew. William took a small chisel from his pocket and began carving words into the old wooden gate. The letters formed slowly, deliberate and deep. Justice doesn't need a uniform, only a heart still brave. When he finished, he stepped back. Rebel lay beside him, head resting on his dusty boots, watching the horizon where the sun sank behind the hills. The fields shimmered in the fading light, and the air hummed with the sound of cicadas. The world, for once, felt still. William looked down at his companion and smiled. "We made it, partner," he said quietly. Rebel gave a soft huff in reply, eyes closing as if in agreement. The wind rose again, gentle this time, carrying the scent of mesquite and hope. And so, after all the noise, all the storms, Coyote Ridge found its light again.